For decades, the Soviet Union looked almost impossible to defeat. It had millions of soldiers, thousands of nuclear weapons, and it controlled half of Europe. And then, in 1991, it just disappeared. Not after a foreign army conquered Moscow. Not after a nuclear war. The country simply ceased to exist. So how does a superpower collapse without being defeated?
Okay, let's really think about this for a second. Because what makes this whole event so profoundly mysterious is just how silent it was. We are talking about the vanishing of a terrifying globe-spanning superpower. Yet there was no great final battle, no apocalyptic showdown. The nation just quietly lowered its flag on a cold December night. For the historians, the political scientists, and especially the people actually living through it, it was an impossible reality. A state built on absolute control and massive military might doesn't just evaporate into thin air. So to understand why it did, we have to look past the surface. We have to follow a bizarre chain reaction that ultimately brought down an empire.
At its absolute peak, the Soviet Union wasn't just another country. It was one entire half of a global rivalry. It projected this terrifying external image of strength: millions of troops, strategic nuclear parity with the US, total dominance over Eastern Europe. But beneath that image, something was fundamentally shifting. The problem wasn't that the Soviet Union suddenly became weak on the outside. The problem was that the internal system holding it all together was becoming incredibly difficult to sustain. You had aging infrastructure, endless lines for basic groceries, and this completely hollowed-out consumer reality. And this created a really dangerous trade-off. The state had to maintain its position as a global military juggernaut, while its domestic reality was just struggling to keep up. But as you'll see, that was only the beginning of the story.
Now, naturally, you might assume that this internal strain, combined with some massive external pressure, is what finally broke the system. Take the Soviet-Afghan War, for example. By 1985, the estimated cost of this conflict was somewhere between $4 and $5 billion. It was a brutal, grueling conflict that definitely added severe pressure to an already stressed system. But here is the unexpected twist. When you actually look at the raw data from our sources, for a military numbering 5 million troops, those financial losses were considered almost negligible. As tragic as the war was in human terms, the monetary cost just wasn't particularly crushing for a superpower of this scale. The war was a crack in the foundation, for sure, but it wasn't the wrecking ball.
So what about the economy? Well, the most surprising number from this entire era might just be 1.9%. That was the annual GDP growth of the Soviet Union from 1981 to 1985. Yeah, the economy was actually still growing. Yes, there was stagnation. Yes, consumer goods were scarce, factories totally lacked innovation, and citizens faced everyday hardships. But the budget deficit in 1985 was less than 2% of GDP. Inflation-adjusted wages were actually on the rise. The system was definitely inefficient, but financially speaking, it wasn't facing immediate collapse. That acute financial crisis wouldn't truly hit until much later.
The absolutely crucial point to remember here is that chronic ailments are not necessarily fatal. Economic trade-offs, widespread inefficiency, costly foreign wars, these were basically standard operating procedure for totalitarian regimes. If you look at history, dictatorships survive far worse economic deprivation all the time, without surrendering even a single ounce of control. In fact, hardship usually just results in heavier repression, not a sudden voluntary dissolution of the government. So if the structural foundation, the economy and the military, wasn't fatally compromised in the mid-1980s, what actually caused the whole thing to implode?
Well, the answer isn't found in economic ledgers. It's actually found in a profound, hidden moral crisis right inside the Kremlin itself. Listen to this quote from Nikolai Ryzhkov, who would go on to become the Soviet Prime Minister. He stated that, by 1985, the stuffiness of the country has reached the maximum. After that, only death. We wallowed in our lies. I mean, that is an astonishing admission coming from the absolute peak of Soviet power. The leadership wasn't suffocating from poverty. They were suffocating from the system's pervasive deception and deep spiritual decline. The people at the very top simply couldn't stomach the hypocrisy anymore.
And this brings us to a really pivotal realization. Key figures like Alexander Yakovlev, alongside Mikhail Gorbachev, recognized that fixing the economy was literally impossible without first righting the severe moral and political wrongs of the past. The crisis wasn't just material anymore. It was a crisis of human dignity. They understood that you couldn't build a functioning modern society on a foundation of terror and forced compliance. So they set out to cure what they genuinely saw as a sick, amoral society. If you want hard proof of just how deeply this moral crusade ran, just look at the financial fallout of the Soviet anti-alcohol campaign between 1985 and 1988. Vodka sales were a massive, massive source of revenue for the Soviet state. Yet the leadership deliberately chose to slash production to combat widespread alcoholism. And that choice cost the treasury a staggering 67 billion rubles. To put that into perspective, that was nearly 17% of the state's revenue in a single year. They willingly accepted an absolute financial disaster because to them, the morals of the nation had to be rescued at any cost. This was not an economic reform, it was a moral purification.
And that quest for purification led them to unleash their ultimate weapon, which brings us to arguably the most consequential word in our explainer today, glasnost. It translates to openness and freedom of speech. Yakovlev and Gorbachev sincerely believed that allowing truth into the public sphere would cleanse the system of its ubiquitous lies and ultimately strengthen a reformed, humane version of socialism. But here's the catch with the truth: you can't control it. Once it was introduced, it didn't act as a cure. It acted as a sledgehammer to the very foundation of the state.
Let's map out exactly how this unfolded, because it's a fascinating chain reaction. Step 1. The leadership themselves demand a moral truth. Step 2. Glasnost is officially unleashed upon the public. Step 3. Suddenly, the deeply repressive, bloody history of the regime is exposed to the masses for the very first time. And finally, Step 4. The total and absolute loss of regime legitimacy. What started as a top-down, tightly controlled attempt at reform rapidly transformed into an uncontrollable avalanche.
And wow, what an avalanche it was. Yakovlev basically orchestrated rapid, lightning strikes of truth. He replaced hardline editors, which allowed banned anti-Stalinist literature to completely flood the streets. He pushed through the release of heavily censored films. More than 400,000 churches and mosques were suddenly returned to believers. The state even formally rehabilitated hundreds of thousands of Stalin's innocent victims. Almost overnight, the public was drowning in the horrifying reality of their own history, a history that had been brutally suppressed for decades.
But the real turning point arrived when the regime's darkest secret was finally laid bare. They exposed the secret protocols of the 1939 Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, which proved that the Soviet Union had actively conspired with Hitler to carve up Europe. Facing the Soviet parliament, Yakovlev delivered this devastating line: "There can be no relativity in morality." Confronting this history completely destroyed the illusion of Soviet stability and righteousness. The regime's past wasn't just flawed or misguided anymore. To the public, it was now fundamentally illegitimate, criminal, and deeply shameful.
All of this culminated in a moment that is almost impossible to imagine happening in any other authoritarian states. In August 1990, on state television, the Soviet leadership publicly repented. Yakovlev looked directly into the camera and told the nation, "Regarding the victims of the state, it is not them that we are forgiving. It is ourselves. It is we who are to blame." This was the emotional climax of the era. The leadership formally and publicly admitted ultimate guilt. And in doing so, they permanently broke the spell of totalitarian terror. You simply cannot maintain an empire of fear when the men in charge are begging for forgiveness. Which brings us to the ultimate conclusion of our story. The sudden collapse of the Soviet Union wasn't just a structural failure, a bankruptcy, or a military defeat. It was a qualitative breakthrough in consciousness. It was an irreversible moral awakening. Once the people and the leadership tasted the truth, they simply refused to live the lie anymore. The entire system had lost its justification for existing in the minds of the very people who inhabited it.
And that leaves us with a pretty profound thought to end on today. We spend so much time looking at the structural might of nations, right? Their armies, their economies, their geographic borders. But if one of the most powerful empires in human history was ultimately brought down not by bombs, but by a moral awakening and the sudden exposure to the truth, what does that mean for the authoritarian regimes of today? It's a stark reminder of the absolute fragility of power built on deception and the truly unstoppable force of the human spirit once it is finally exposed to